Welcome, everybody, to Science from the Fringe. I am here with my colleague, Bryce Nickels, professor of genetics at Rutgers University. I'm Professor Jay Bhattacharya, and we are delighted to have with us in the studio Joomi Kim, who is a biologist, in fact, a fantastic biologist, and who's been active throughout the whole pandemic with analyzing COVID vaccines, publicly communicating it through her Substack. And most recently, Joomi has put together a video, a remarkable hour-and-a-half video explaining to her colleagues and her friends and her parents and all her family why she intends to vote for President Trump. Joomi, thank you for coming and thank you for agreeing to talk with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
The most interesting, I mean, it was a really interesting video, but the most interesting thing is the fact that you felt like you had to make the video. That to me was the most, and of course, the video itself has a tremendous amount of interesting content, both about COVID and a whole host of other topics. I figured it'd be really fun to go through this with you. First, to talk about like what motivated you to make it, like what's the specific content you put into it, and then to talk about the culture of academics, about why such a thing is necessary. I mean, it struck me as necessary also, for somebody to do that, and it's funny that it would be necessary because a vote is a private thing. It's not a matter of judgment about who you are as a person. It's just you prefer one candidate or another. That would be the normal way of thinking, but in fact, that's not actually the reality of American academics, where a vote is almost like a judgment on your moral character. Did I read too much into the video, Joomi? Is that the sort of motivation?
No, the motivation is pretty much how you described it. So I don't think there's a way to tell someone who's a Democrat, a lifelong Democrat, like I'm going to vote for Trump, and they're going to be horrified usually, right? And they're not going to understand it, and it's very difficult to explain it to them in just a minute or two, because we've been living in whole other worlds, So if you haven't been seeing certain things like censorship and all these other things, like to them it's a horrifying decision, that's something that they just cannot understand, and especially in academia since they're so politically on the left. And the reason I made it was that I just knew that I wouldn't be able to explain my vote to friends and family in just a minute or two, and I had to show all these receipts, that appear on the video.
Well, why don't we go through the videos? We'll focus on like whatever you'd like to focus on. But I was particularly interested. I mean, you had me in the video, so of course I was a little bit interested in that.
Wait a second, hold on, Jay. You were in a video. I thought you were heavily censored. What are you doing in a video?
This was exactly Joomi's point, Bryce. Bryce,
I see you everywhere, Jay, and I've been told that you're censored, and I have a hard time believing it. But
we're going to talk about
we'll
how modern censorship actually works. Right? We will school you on the mechanics of modern censorship as we go through this. Joomi, please, why don't you start?
Yeah. So I was always a lifelong Democrat, and coming from the political left, and I was in academia as well. I was at Rutgers University. That's where I did my PhD. And then after that, worked in tech for a bit. And
Joomi, what was your PhD in?
So it was on understanding a link between the cell cycle and metabolism in diatoms, which are unicellular algae. It was actually funded by the NSF. It was supposed to be a way to try to get algae to make oil that you could turn into biodiesel. So that was the project.
So you went into science wanting to like improve the environment.
Yeah.
You had like, I mean, you wanted to apply scientific ideas to essentially improve the world. Like I think motivates many scientists, and certainly you as you entered science.
The environment was always a big deal for me. That was also one of the reasons why I was a Democrat for many years. I thought that they were better on the environment. I don't really think that anymore, but we can get to that. So after my PhD, worked in tech for a bit, and then I just started writing about COVID once the vaccines came out. Now, I actually took the vaccines. I got 2 doses of Moderna. But at some point after that, maybe a few months after, I don't remember exactly, I started looking into some of the statements that were being made. There was some controversy online about things like spike proteins. Some people were saying that it was cytotoxic. and then you see Reuters fact check articles saying there's no evidence that suggests this, But I looked into it a little bit, and I saw that there was actually evidence. There were a lot of papers, showing like harms from spike protein. So I was pretty shocked when I saw how blatantly the media was lying about certain things. So I just started writing because I just had to get it out. And then from there, I just kept writing.
I mean, you have a Substack.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been a regular reader, actually, Joomi, of your Substack, because I've learned. I mean, as Bryce will tell you, I'm not a biologist. I have my PhDs in economics. I'm an MD, so I've read a bunch of biology, but I'm not a biologist. And I have to say, for listeners, if you want to learn a lot of biology about the COVID vaccines, about the biology of COVID, the virus itself, and just a whole host of really interesting topics, Joomi's Substack is a great place to look up. Actually, remind me the name. Let's tell the leaders their name.
It's called
We got to advertise you, Joomi.
Let's Be Clear. It's called Let's Be Clear. It's at joomi.substack.com.
Fantastic. Okay, so you're writing on the COVID vaccine, and on the biology of COVID, and what was the reaction that you got from to Substack?
Well, it's very, very mixed. I think for some people, they appreciated it, but of course, I was also called an anti-vaxxer and all these things online. Somebody tried to get me fired from the job I had at the time. Luckily it worked out fine, but I mean, they're crazy people. I mean, I'm sure Bryce has experienced even more of it than I had. Yeah, but actually, when it came to people that I knew, friends that I got them to read it, and it actually was surprisingly okay. Like I think because they knew that I wasn't some kind of crazy anti-vaxxer. They knew that okay, there are some good points here. So. But yeah, I still get continually called anti-vaxxer.
I mean, you have a PhD in biology from Rutgers University. You evidently understand biology at a deep level, molecular biology at a deep level, and you're very clearly capable of reading and reporting on scientific papers. It's kind of remarkable, right, to have a situation where like you're going to get attacked for sort of working through the skills and publicly talking about applying those skills to important topics of public interest. It's kind of a remarkable thing. And Bryce, you also were subject to similar things, right? When you were at like through the last couple of years.
It's useful to be tenured because tenure is a very, provides you with, protection against, people that are bad actors that are trying to, disrupt your workplace. But they, multiple letters have been sent to Rutgers, various people at Rutgers, to try to make my, situation there, uncomfortable. Of course, one of them led to articles in Science Magazine and the LA Times, which are, things that show up if you Google search my name. Like the first thing that comes up is like, people, like who's making the COVID debate toxic? Professor Bryce Nickels and Richard E. Bright are, which of course it had the best correction of any article. There's science article written about me, Jay, and Joomi. This had the best correction ever, which said soon after the article, soon after we contacted Dr. Nickels for comment, he went back to calling his opponents murderers. Like that was the last sentence in the article, but then they had to remove that because that was just factually incorrect. So it has that correction. Like we apologize for this statement.
I think these are all things that are within the bounds, to me, within the bounds of what one would want to be able to talk about in academics and outside of academics, right? It's the kind of thing, and yet, Joomi, a major theme of your video was that it was very difficult to talk about this.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, so ironically, that my video, you can't find it on YouTube, even if you search for it using its exact title. But I'm just so grateful that it stayed up on YouTube. That's where we are. Yeah, and so many channels they got demonetized or just their videos were taken down completely, right? Over COVID. It seems like you can talk about it a little bit more now, but it's still, there's still all this censorship. But Twitter, it looks like, is, some place where you can be much more open. But it's still unacceptable because a lot of people aren't on Twitter.
Yeah, well, it did go viral on Twitter. But I want to explore the angle of why is it that that it was you put it in a video of explaining why you're going to vote for Trump, because that seems interesting. Because I agree with you, Jimmy. That it struck me. I was put on a Twitter blacklist in 2021 when I joined Twitter. I believe at the behest of the Biden administration. Like and when I have looked at the data coming out of the Missouri versus Biden lawsuit, the Twitter files, it's Biden administration officials that essentially made it a policy to pressure social media to censor. And it's hard to get that fact across to people. It is true that in 2020 that there was communication between administration officials and the Trump administration, but the kind of communication, that kind of communication, in order to like tell the social media companies, oh, this kind of thing is true, this kind of thing is not true, it really amplified in 2021, especially with the release of the vaccine. And it was essentially an official policy of the Biden administration to censor even true speech online that contradicted its policies regarding the vaccine. And I mean, it struck me that you put that in there as an argument to vote for Trump, or at least an argument not to vote for Harris.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time on that, on the censorship, because I think so many people aren't aware of it. People who are still Democrats, plan to vote for Kamala Harris. She said very concerning things about moderating, content on social media, which is just another word for censorship, right? And so has Tim Walz. And I think so many people are just unaware of all that's been happening, all this censorship that's been happening, of all the discussions about COVID vaccines and about the origins of SARS-CoV-2, all these things, or you with lockdowns, right? So yeah, a lot of people just don't know. They've been in a bubble. So I just felt like this was all a part of showing them the part of the world that they've been missing the last 3 years.
Can I make a point about that though? Just it's like related to whether the fact that there is censorship would matter with certain people. I wouldn't assume. I mean, I'm assuming that the Harris campaign has, polled that issue to see if it's a winning issue. So I would guess that. I mean, you would think they pulled this, and because if it was not working with their core, they wouldn't be saying it, right? So I have found, the few times I brought that up with, very, progressive Democrat friends of mine, their reaction is to say false information shouldn't, like that they think false information shouldn't be allowed to be disseminated to the public. Like it's very strange. Like that's their immediate reaction. So I do actually wonder how many people that are, Democrats, conventional Democrats, are just okay with it. Even if you put this to them and say, here's clear evidence of censorship, are you okay with this? They might be okay with it. That's was all these things are very disturbing to me, but for
No,
what
I,
it's worth.
no, I think you're right. I think that there has been this propaganda campaign to demonize misinformation, and of course, nobody likes misinformation online, falsehoods. But it's worse to have some kind of central authority to try to censor, And one of the things I was trying to do in the video was just to show, like, here's an example where the government censored experts about lockdowns, and what we got were prolonged lockdowns, right? That just did all of this damage. So if anyone spread misinformation that was harmful, it was our leaders.
I mean, I think that that's a very important point, right? So if you have a central authority, a government that says X is wrong, but X isn't wrong, X is actually true, that does quite a bit more damage, I think, than if somebody on the internet says that X is wrong, right? I mean, someone in the internet, they may have some reputation, they may not have some reputation, but they don't have the capacity to enforce policy or enact policy on the basis of a false belief about X. Does are lockdowns harmful to children? Or school closures harmful to children, right? Or do the high quality randomized studies show that masks are effective, right? Those are all like really important topics that came up during the pandemic, and yet the government often would put out information that contradicted what the scientific evidence was showing, as your Substack showed often with the COVID vaccines, Joomi. But nevertheless, the people that were putting out the corrections to the government misinformation, they were censored or labeled as misinformers. And it's very difficult to correct that. And then policy then is adopted on top of it. And then on top of that, you said you use the word propaganda. The effect of that is that a vast number of people believe the false thing because there's no self-correcting mechanism allowed.
This sort of fear-mongering about misinformation online from social media users. I mean, what are some examples that have caused so much harm that could compare to the misinformation that the government spread? Like what do they say to that?
I'll tell you, I went to the Supreme Court with the Missouri versus Biden case, and I actually sat in the hearing that over the preliminary injunction in my case, in that case where I was involved, and one of the justices defending this ability of the government to suppress misinformation, she had a hypothetical example. She said, suppose there's a social media trend of kids jumping out of buildings. They film themselves jumping out of like first story buildings, second story buildings, third story buildings, and increasingly higher stories, daring other kids to jump out of higher stories of buildings. She asked, shouldn't the government have the capacity to force the social media companies to take down that kind of speech? And so a couple things struck me. Like one is the fact that she had to resort to a hypothetical rather than an actual example, because an actual example with this would be, if there's like a social media trend like this on Facebook or something, what happens is that there's tremendous pressure privately on Facebook on people just like saying, look, why are you amplifying this content, right? So I watched Mark Zuckerberg, for instance, have to go to Congress to defend Facebook's allowing content that promoted suicide among kids on Facebook. Now, you don't need the government to tell him not to promote that content. They themselves, the social media companies themselves, have their brand gets damaged pretty harsh when they're promoting that kind of content. And the government's almost always late to the game, right? It's the second thing that my response to that was like, my God, the problem was during the pandemic was that the government was closing schools, harming kids. It's as if the government was saying that the kids should jump out of windows. That's the metaphor, right? And they were suppressing the people. They were telling the kids not to jump out of windows. They were suppressing the people saying, look, schools should be open. And schools closed at scale as a result of the government misinformation. It's just striking. Like the harm to kids was much greater because the government censored the critics of this misinformation put out by the government.
And I was going to also mention other things like when people couldn't go to their AA meetings and things like that, and couldn't get their counseling help and all these other things that led to more suicides and drug abuse, overdoses, etc.
You're both having a very serious conversation, and I was trying to look for a place where I could make a joke about how Jay was tricked into doing the Tide Pod challenge because of a social media trend.
I mean,
that
right,
just went awry.
They look like candy. Let's just be clear. They look like candy. And
I know, and it looks delicious. It looks so delicious. Anyway, yeah.
But the thing is, I mean, that's a good example, right? The Tide Pod challenge was met almost immediately with like vast numbers of like very, very serious people posting, "Don't eat this. This is crazy. Don't this is
right."
Um,
Too late for you. Unfortunately, you had a trip to the hospital,
I
which
did not actually, just for the record, that is misinformation that Bryce just literally just right now put out.
which we allow on this show. Okay.
Um, yeah, so Jimmy, I mean, I think that so to me that struck me as like as your video. That was like that was a very very strong argument, right? That in fact, I mean, I've wondered about this myself. Would I could I vote for somebody that censored me, like personally censored me, like some government official? And it's just kind of hard. It's hard to get my mind around the idea that I might. I don't understand why. But it's worse than that. It's not just that I can't like decide not to vote for the person that like some politician that's arguing to censor me in particular, and actually has censored me in particular. The question then is, am I like, is there something like morally wrong with me for uh, for for like resisting that? Like why in this case are the Democrats the good guys?
Well, I think
Almost unthinkingly the good guys in this.
their argument is just, oh, Trump is just worse. He's a fascist. He's Hitler and all these things, you know, which is why I also spent all this time in the video debunking all these lies that they've told about Trump over the years. Not that he doesn't have his flaws, he does, but he's not Hitler or a fascist, and he hasn't said a lot of the things that they've said that he said. You know, so that's their main argument, honestly.
Like that full clip with Charlottesville is just insane. You want to discuss that quick? I mean, that one to me is the most egregious because it keeps being brought up and it's
Yeah.
baked into everyone's head. You can you just describe that real quick? Because I still think a lot of the presidential candidates still say it. You know, like Harris says it, I believe. I mean, Biden certainly said it at the debate.
Oh no, Harris said it too in the debate. Yeah, she said it.
Harris, yeah, it's absurd. Like that really. Can you just briefly summarize that for people? I don't know if everyone has actually seen the full clip.
Yeah, so the media and Kamala Harris and Biden, all the Democrats have continually said that Trump was saying that in that speech after the whole Charlottesville riot, that when he said there were fine people on both sides, he was including neo-Nazis and white nationalists. But when you watch the full clip, it's absolutely clear that he does not mean, you know, white nationalists or neo-Nazis. He was talking about people who were there to protest the removal of a statue. And he explicitly made it clear, like, I don't mean the neo-Nazis or the white nationalists. And he said that multiple times, actually, in that clip. And that watching that clip, the full clip, that was actually a moment for me because by then I had already, you know, learned about some things related to COVID, and I knew that the media definitely lied about a lot of things. But I wasn't ready to vote for Trump or anything like that. But when I watched that clip, I I had this moment where I was like, okay, I need to question everything that I've been told about Trump because this is such a blatant lie, you know? And what I realized was that I had never really spent much time listening to Trump himself. All my opinions about him had been through the media, through a media filter telling me what to think about him instead of actually listening to his own words. And I think that's the case for a lot of people. They haven't actually listened to things that Trump actually said. In part, the media has made it so painful for them to like listen to him, you know?
I actually met him in person in the Oval Office, Jumi, and I was struck how different he was in person than the view that I had garnered from him from the media. Right, I was expecting a blowhard, and actually, what he was like he was. This was July 2020 or August 2020. I forget the exact date. And I was invited there to along with Martin Kulldorff and a couple other folks to sit and talk with him about COVID policy. And we were supposed to talk with him for 5 minutes. First, he was very gracious. Like I'm brown. Joe Ladipo was there, the Surgeon General of Florida. He's African American. He was gracious. I mean, there was no. I didn't. I mean, I've been in front of racists before, people I thought might be racist, and there was none of. I didn't get any of that vibe. So I just that first off was like, this is strange that people told me that he's some kind of racist. He's not. I just self-evidently in his personal relation with me, not. In the context of that conversation, we were supposed to go for 5 minutes. He kept asking question after question, and he kept us there for an hour and a half. but much longer than 5 minutes, that's for sure. Um, and like I didn't think of him as I previously interacted with Ron DeSantis, um, who he reads DeSantis reads scientific papers as best I can tell. Like DeSantis will talk to you about particular papers and footnotes. Trump doesn't have that kind of depth of knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
but he's very curious, which is something I thought was not the case before I actually met him. Right, that's something that like the idea that he's some sort of incurious, not particularly kind of smart guy is just. I mean, it's false. I mean, it's just false. Like he's not like deeply into epidemiological literature. That's true. But I don't know. I've met very few politicians, that are. It just struck me that the kind of person that he was, self-evidently in front of me, was very, very different from the picture that I had garnered from the media about him.
Yeah, yeah, and now that I've spent some time actually listening to some of his interviews and speeches, I mean, how I see him is very different than how I did in 2016. When I thought he was horrible. And he's actually got a sense of humor too, which I wasn't aware of. Actually, I'm just
Yeah, I mean,
curious.
I mean that is.
Sorry, in the conversation you had with him, did he express any sort of regrets over some of his decisions during COVID, like lockdowns or related to vaccines or anything?
The probably the most striking moment was, and I was warned in advance that he was going to ask me this. He asked me if he said that he shut the economy down in March 2020, because if he didn't do it, 2 million people were going to die. And he said, look, did I save 2 million people by locking down? And the basis for that number, I knew, was that a very faulty model put out by a team at Imperial College London, that estimated that if the United States didn't lock down, there'd be 2 million deaths within a month or two. And so Trump, I mean, he looked like he was just shaking. He's like, I mean, he was doing the Trump thing with the hands. But he had like he said, look, I had the economy is going gangbusters. And he was like very focused on his reelection. I was going to win the reelection easily, but then they told me 2 million people are going to die, so I closed the economy down. That's the way he put it. I mean, I had to tell him that his decision did not save 2 million lives, that the model itself was faulty, and he just looked sad. I've seen him since talk about how many lives he saved, and it's I can understand it, right? You're a politician that made this like incredibly consequential decision that ex post looks really bad. At least in my eyes, looked really bad, right? So you can compare to Sweden. The same model applied to Sweden estimated there'd be 100,000 deaths within a month, and there was like on the order of hundreds or something, not hundreds of 100,000 deaths. So the model itself was faulty. Ex post, he was wrong, right? He didn't save that many lives. He didn't save. In fact, I don't believe he saved any lives at all with the lockdowns.
But Jay, after you met with him, is he still repeating that number?
He still sometimes says that number.
I see.
I've seen him. Yeah,
Right. So that's,
he's a
but
politician.
right.
He's
Well, sure. I mean, we could, I guess, of course, I was going to say, Jay, you knew you should have said in the moment, like, sir, you did not save 2 million at all. You saved 200 million. Give it up. Like that's the way to do it. You got to be a politician yourself.
Dude, I literally, I was like, okay, Bryce, I was,
I know.
the thing for me was like, how many times do you get to go to the Oval Office and advise the president? It's probably the last time I'll ever do that, right? So, and I'm like, okay, you have to tell the truth. You have to tell him,
of course,
or her, the absolute truth, no matter what it is, even if it's inconvenient for you.
But Jay, I would actually draw a parallel there with the way, like, obviously, I mean, you're a different person, but the way you were presented to scientists, and I don't know, maybe Joomi, you saw the way Jay was depicted as well. And for whether Jay's completely wrong or not about the policy thing, the representation of him as this horrific, like grifting bad actor is just demonstrably false. And it so like when you meet him, like you just know that's true, but it's I guess the same thing you're saying, Jay, in terms of at least the way you when you interacted with Trump, you got a different picture than the way it's depicted in the media. But regardless, I think that ideally we could get even politicians to be closer to the truth. Um, and scientists especially, we need to get closer to the truth. But like you said, Jimmy, with the, I mean, when you discuss Trump, you always get the both sides thing, like, or like, you know, there's just another thing that can be said that he's terrible for, right? Like, so it's almost just like a pointless exercise in having conversations to try to say like he's not as, it's like he's certainly not Hitler, he's not a fascist. Has he done some stuff? Yes, but we're talking about, you know, these like misrepresentations of him we should all oppose. Like that Charlottesville thing is absurd. I was really upset when Biden brought it up at the first debate because it's been so long. We know that's wrong. Like the tape's there. Like who are people just not curious about that? And especially if you're going to accuse him of being the biggest liar, you don't use like an incredible lie. I don't know. So
Well, Jumi, it's like it struck me that watching the video and especially that bit about the like how Trump is misrepresented, a lot of the media essentially jump on things that he says and and like read it in the worst possible light. Whereas, like, if you like Biden, for instance, just as we're recording this video, just a couple of days ago, gave this interview, I think in the Oval Office. I'm sure where he's given it from, where he referenced Trump voters as garbage. And then what ensued was within the media a whole host of people trying to defend Biden as having misspoke. And maybe he did. I don't know. I mean, maybe he misspoke. I mean, I don't think it's for politically smart to refer to half the country as garbage. So, and Biden's, I'm sure, a very good politician. So he probably did misspeak. But the media treated the Biden statement, I think, in good faith, like trying to, in fact, more than good faith, trying to like sort of read it in the most benign possible light. Whereas almost anything Trump says is read in the most severe possible light.
Yeah, I don't even think we can say that it was in good faith. I think it was political, actually, where they inserted a word that Biden hadn't said to make it sound like Biden wasn't talking about Trump supporters, but something like the hatred of Trump supporters. But when you listen to the clip of what Biden said, it's not how Political described it. So it's clearly biased. And one of the points I was making in my video was that there seems to be this machine, and the corporate media is definitely part of it, and they favor one side much more than the other. Namely, they favor the Democrats, and they do everything they can to try to destroy Trump because he's this outsider.
So in what sense would it be better if Trump were to win for the COVID origins discussion rather than Harris to win? Like, why is that a partisan issue?
Okay, two things come to mind. One has to do with censorship, just not having censoring of the conversation. The other is my guess would have to do with appointments in his cabinet, like who's if you had a continuation of the Biden administration, which I think Kamala Harris would be, would have people who are just status quo, who just are happy to, sweep this all under the rug. I don't know whether under a Trump administration you'd have appointments of people who would want to investigate this, but I think there's a greater chance. I don't know, Bryce, you may know more about that here.
it's not clear how far any administration will allow that investigation to go. I mean, you have to, of course, the FBI. So I guess this is, so let me try to get the, I believe the FBI shut down the COVID origins investigation in April-ish of 2020. So a lot of this happened under the first Trump administration, right? So whether one would hope, well, okay, I don't know. The honest thing is, we're going to try to pursue the truth, okay? Like, I am going to pursue the truth. Like, we all should expect the truth. I don't know. I have no idea if what we'll get under a Trump administration but I do firmly believe that we'll get closer to the truth with a change in the administration. It's just there's just very it's hard to argue against that given the NIH itself is withholding a ton of information. And I will say that the one person I think is the best on this is Senator Rand Paul. So one thing independent of whether there's a Trump administration or not, if the Senate becomes it flips to Republicans, then Rand Paul will have more power in that committee that he's the will be the chair of, and that will be a big factor in trying to get first closer to the truth. I mean, but again, we get the truth. What the truth is hard won. I got some cliches or something. We have to keep pushing at it, and just because you voted for somebody doesn't mean they may be working towards the truth. We have to hold everybody accountable to try to get that.
The other thing is that under Trump, I mean, yeah, Bobby Kennedy has said he would play a role somehow, and he's obviously been quite vocal on this issue. So, this is why I think that we'd have at least better appointments in some of these agencies.
I mean, I think, Joomi, I think you're right in that sense. Like the Biden appointments in those positions, they seem like they really aren't interested. And Bryce, I mean, I'm sure you've seen this when in the hearings where Tony Fauci appears in front of Congress, it's and specifically on COVID origins, there's this very deep partisan divide where the Republicans seem much more skeptical about his view about his role, where his defense of his role as a head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, and his role specifically in funding gain of function work, the kind of gain of function work that you and I and Biosafety Now are trying to regulate more effectively. Whereas the Democrats, I mean, I don't want to be impolite, but like I don't really understand. They basically worship him, even when he's sitting there telling them things that are just demonstrably untrue.
We've talked about this before. Democrats have firmly said we are the party of science. That's and the Republicans are the ones that are anti-science. Now, what that usually means, the number one issue to me on that is climate. Okay, and that's why I was going to connect it to Joomi because your PhD advisor, I believe, was Paul Falkowski at Rutgers. Is that correct? Yeah. And I think he's involved in a lot of climate science stuff. Is that accurate or?
He is. Yeah.
So the climate issue is the one that always gets pointed to as Republicans bad, Democrats good. So I'm curious what Joomi thinks about that one. But then there's the vaccines as well, which is number two, I think, with what anti-science is. So it's really vaccines and climate are why Democrats kind of have to protect Fauci, I believe, because Fauci is the science, right? So if their ability to get, understand what Fauci truly was and is, maybe that's preventing them from, I think, doing the right thing. Like it's so disappointing the way they are viewing this as we must protect Anthony Fauci at all costs. And so that's why, Joomi, what do you think about this, the way in which climate is used?
Yeah, good question. So I'm not an expert in the climate change science, but I obviously thought that it was a problem because my PhD research was something that was supposed to help with climate change. I still think that climate change is probably happening. I mean, and at least partially due to human activities. But I don't trust a lot of the models, especially some of the more catastrophic ones. And they've been saying certain things like, "Oh, we're going to have this, this, and this happen in the next 5, 10 years," and it doesn't happen. And modeling is so incredibly complex. Trying to model climate. So I don't believe that they are as sure about that as they say they are. And I think that they've tried to censor debate on it. So this is starting to look familiar with territory that I am more sure about, and they're trying to censor debate and they're trying to make their projections look a lot more confident um, than they should. Now, when it comes to Republicans, yes, I think some Republicans, I disagree with them when they say like, oh, it's just climate change isn't happening, because I think it probably is, But on the other hand, with Democrats, their entire environmental platform is only about climate. They never talk about, pesticides, or other chemicals, and like highly processed foods and like microplastics in our environment that we're just like inhaling and ingesting and drinking constantly. That these things aren't getting regulated, or about species extinction, or invasive species. Like they never talk about any of those things. Deforestation. I mean, those are. I would rather, as an environmentalist, focus on those, because those are, for sure, we know that those things are bad and that they're happening, pollution, all these things. The climate thing, I think, and again, I'm not an expert here, there are arguments to be made, including from economists, that like if you were to focus on like economic growth, people will end up caring about things like climate, and naturally we're going to want to have renewables anyway, because like nobody wants to be reliant on fossil fuels forever, so incentivize those things. But I'm distrustful of this agenda of using climate as this way to just put more controls and regulation on things, because there's a lot of money to be made on these like regulations. Some people are going to win really big with a lot of those agendas. So that's a long-winded way of saying that I used to think that the Democrats were much more for science. Now I think that they're weaponizing this climate change thing, and they've co-opted, quote, science, to be on their side. I just no longer think that's the case. That's not to say that the Republicans are perfect on science, but at least they're not the ones saying that we should censor science or censor dissident scientists, which that is the most anti-science thing imaginable.
It's interesting here you talk about this, because what I hear is there's ambiguity, right? It's not clear that one side is good or bad. In fact, both sides have problems, and both sides have some ideas that are worth listening to. I mean, not that I don't want to be like too even-handed, in the sense that like it maybe one side is better or than another side on something that's possible, but there's ambiguity there. And yet, now to get back to something that Bryce brought up earlier, and yet there's this almost like bigotry in academics against anyone who looks at Republicans and says, well, they might have some good ideas on some things.
There was some poll in Nature that had the respondents to it, 84% were voting for Harris. So I assume this is like scientist heavy. 6% for Trump. Like that's just a problem. It's just a problem. You have a monolith having like such political polarization to the point where you don't even barely have any representation of an entire, like half the country in the sciences. Is just a problem. I'm sorry. If you're going to have to work with deplorable people in your labs, I'm so sorry. But the fact that certain topics become, you can't even discuss them from a scientific standpoint, like the climate thing and vaccines. Like again, this conversation, clip this, because it will be used to say, oh my God, they're climate denialists, flat earthers, paste eater, whatever. That's where we are. There's no curiosity on these issues, which is weird, because the scientists who are commenting with certainty about their knowledge of climate science, as you know, aren't actually climate scientists. They're whatever, they're trained in whatever, biochemistry, or trained in genetics. Like they're so certain about these topics. That's why I wondered if your take on it, and I wondered if you actually had a conversation with your former advisor, what your former advisor would say to you with what you've done. Is he aware of that? Or I'm taking it from your facial response that perhaps he wouldn't be super happy.
It's unclear, but I think he would definitely be surprised, possibly horrified. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Because one of the issues here is that the leaders in the field, like your former advisor is like National Academy member, right? So these are the leaders in the field. They're modeling not being open-minded scientists, right? Like we see this again and again. Closed-minded, the senior people in the field, whatever it is, it's ego, hubris. I don't know. They aren't open-minded often to a junior person questioning things that the senior person, holds
It's
near
not
and
just
dear.
junior people, right? You can be a Oxford
That's true. Yeah.
professor of theoretical epidemiology. You can be a Harvard full professor of biostatistician.
He's always bring. By the way, he's always bringing in the Great Barrington Declaration.
I
Every
don't.
single podcast is always bringing it up. But so,
You get the
Bryce,
full
an
prize
occupational
money.
hazard
yeah.
for associating with me.
To be clear, I don't know whether my former advisor would react. It would be horrified. So I don't want to say that, but my guess is I don't know. I don't want to say this.
So let's move to like the implication of this, right? So um, I remember there in the first Trump administration. I mean, I was a professor. I wasn't in the administration, but I had friends who were junior colleagues who decided that they were going to go work for the Council of Economic Advisors, a big, it's inside the White House, a big prestigious thing for junior economists to like have this, this invitation to go work, and they worked. It's usually a big point of pride for economists to have that invitation, right? Um, and actually go do it for any administration, right? And the norm had been, I thought, in economics that you go advise if you're invited to do it and you have the capacity to do it, you go do it, no matter whether you agree with the administration or not. You do your very best to try to give the president good economic advice. Um, and there's a whole structure around this, but like it's a big prestigious thing for a junior person to be invited to do this. I watched on Facebook a whole bunch of, I'm like friends with a whole bunch of economists, you might imagine, because I have a PhD in economics. The senior people in economics essentially excoriate this young economist who had been invited to work for the CEA. And he said yes, he went and worked for the CEA. And the only reason was because he was working for Trump. And so the consequence of this is not just that this human thing where if you say you have some heterodox thought, you're going to be treated as like human garbage. It's that it makes it so that if there is a Republican administration, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that they will not attract good, solid, honest people who would be willing to work for them because they're going to be destroyed by their colleagues just simply because they're giving the president advice, the president that those colleagues absolutely detest advice. It's bad for the country.
I mean, I blame the propaganda. The propagandizing has been so successful, and people just having a snap judgment about all these topics, and that affects science. It's making it hard to do good science.
What has been the reaction of? I mean, do you have like what feedback have you gotten to your video and the fact that, I mean, it's gotten what, like 3 million? Your thread about it got 3 million views, or like how many views did it get?
Yeah, the tweet got three point something million. It's a lot lower on YouTube. But the reaction has been mixed. Okay, so I'll start with the good ones. So I showed a friend. She showed it to her husband and some of her friends who are all very, very lefty. And some of the more lefty friends, they started to, well, first, before they even watched it, they had a reaction. They would be like, what's her motivation for doing this? Like just had all these questions and just had like a whole long text about all this stuff, even before watching it. And then halfway through watching, she had a certain reaction where she started talking about like how oh, this disinformation, we're just not meant to get all this information like in social media. It's unprecedented, the amount of information. We're just too stupid to be able to handle this. So that was at the halfway point. Then she got to the end and she actually said the video was great, and I was shocked. So I don't know beyond that what her, if it's going to change her vote or not, but it did sort of open her eyes to some things. Now that same person shared my video with a colleague of hers, and that person had a very negative take on the video and said that it was like propaganda and all these debunkings that I was doing with Trump, that like, oh, okay, but okay, so he says he's not going to ban abortion, but blah blah blah. I don't even remember what it was because it didn't even make any sense to me. But yeah, so there's been some defensiveness, and some people. It's actually more than once I've noticed that people will have something to say before they even watch it.
But I guess I caught something there. Are you at, so now your friend said, what's your agenda? you just said, I don't know if it's going to change her vote. So it did seem like, do you actually want people to change their vote based on your video? Or are you just putting it out there for information? Like, this is my truth, or you actually want to move votes?
I don't necessarily expect that in most cases, but it's more just to get people to understand half the population and why they're voting the way they are, which, and it's going to be a lot of their own friends and family. And I want them to stop talking about Trump supporters as if they're all deplorable, horrible, racist people that are just stupid, because it's just not the case, and like, I'm also thinking about just what's going to happen after the election, even after Trump wins. If half the population thinks that the other half are all racist and crazy, like that is not a good place for the country to be in. It's just like asking for civil war and trouble, and Trump wouldn't be able. It makes his job much harder to govern, right? If half the population is so divided. So I was thinking about it not just in time for the election day, but what's going to happen after the election, because we need to wake up some of the rest of the people who have been in a corporate media bubble, right? They need to wake up, because honestly, it's not fun being around them sometimes, because of the snide remarks they'll make and all these assumptions that they'll have. So yeah, multiple motivations, and sure, it's great if they change their minds and change their vote. But I don't know if I would expect it just from like one video. Like it took me a long time for me to get to the place where I am. You know,
Okay, so what is the step? What's the way forward? We're coming up on an hour. I think this is, we should end on this topic, because this is something that's, I mean, it's been the center of my mind for a long time. It's like, how do you get along with people that are acting like you're a deplorable, like you're human garbage, like you're there's something so fundamentally wrong with you that there's nothing you can say that would be of value to them, because they think that you have values that are just so fundamentally opposed to them, even though that's actually not the case.
Well, I was going to say, do you think, just like in a little addendum there, because it would influence the answer here. Do we need to have enemies? Like, as individuals, do we have to hate something to exist? Do some people need that? I guess the question to me is, I I I I personally feel that some of this is simply because in order for me to exist in society, I need to have some enemy or something. Meaning, like, some of this is that if the consideration of people as deplorable is irrational, why why in the face of very clear evidence that somebody's not deplorable or whatever, is the logical mind not moving? Is it because in at heart we do need something to other, we need somebody to hate, we need somebody to not be like, so that we can be good, or something like that? We do tend to, like, it's a very effective strategy to try to make people that you're trying to silence and out to be horrible people and enemies and bad, right? So it's not something that is going away. So I think, I personally, I just think that's a major reason for the use of that for the two political parties, to make the supporters of the other party the enemy is effective.
I mean, I don't think it's necessary for people to have that. I mean, maybe for some people, but I blame a lot of this on the media, on the propaganda, that they've demonized so many people, Trump supporters and all these other, or climate deniers or anti-vaxxers, that the way they've demonized people. If we hadn't had that, uh, I don't think it, in fact, just a few years ago, uh, floating the idea that vaccines, that there might be a link between autism and vaccines, right? You could find the corporate media covering this, in a sort of a curious way, where they're not demonizing people who are um, asking these questions. There's a clip of Joe Scarborough with RFK Jr. and they're talking about this issue from, I don't know if it was probably more than 10 years ago. But at some point, the media really turned on this issue and like really demonized anti-vaxxers on this. And we've seen over and over again how the corporate media can really act almost like in unison, to demonize a certain segment of the population. And the propaganda is really, really strong. So I think that the way forward has to be to get more and more people to see how the media lies to them, how they manipulate them, how they will smear people, make them seem like crazy, people. I think that there is hope in this regard because more and more people are uh, suspicious of the media and that they have less trust in it. That's my hope, at least. I mean, we're so far from it still, but you look at the trends; they are realizing it. You know.
I mean, it's striking a couple of thoughts and provoked by what you just said. So one on vaccines, um, I've say like the most effective anti-vax thing that I've ever seen in my career in public health is when public health officials, including people like Tony Fauci or former CDC Director Rochelle Walensky, leaned into the idea that the COVID vaccine would stop you from getting and spreading COVID. It was self-evidently not true. There wasn't good evidence behind it when they said it at the time, and very quickly after they said it, there was like vast evidence to the contrary, and they sort of doubled down on it. The public looked at this and said, well, if they're getting that wrong, maybe they're getting everything wrong on vaccines and whatnot. Um, so the idea then is like the demonization itself creates this fragile thing where the people doing the demonizing, the high government officials doing the censoring, they better be right on everything, or they're going to lose confidence of the public on even more on very essential things, childhood vaccinations or something. It's a very fragile thing. Whereas like an environment of like forgiveness, right, where we allow people to make mistakes and we don't destroy them if they vote for the other party or whatever. That allows there to be people, the high officials to be wrong on something, and then change their messaging, change their tone to say that they were wrong, and then like maintain the confidence the public would have in them, because they're self-evidently honest people with good faith intentions, sometimes make mistakes, but looking for the truth. That it's much less fragile than the equilibrium where we're going to destroy each other every time we say something because you're voting for the wrong person, or because you said something that I don't like.
But we need conflict. Again, sports exist, wars exist. I'm gonna say, like humans thrive on conflict. There's something to that, and the media has a tremendous incentive to create conflict because they're. I think it was Matt Ridley. First was just talking about the model now for media is subscriber based, which means they have to. They're instead of ad based, they're subscriber based, which means there's just built-in audience capture where the audience determines what the content of the paper is or the news source, which means that they are just trying to keep that revenue.
That's true, but there are a lot of stories that the media doesn't. Okay, that's a problem, but I think the bigger problem is money from certain interests that play a big role in these corporations. Whether it's Pfizer or whatever. Because there are a lot of stories that I think the public would be very interested in, but the media doesn't cover it, right? And that's why people like Joe Rogan are so popular. If the New York Times had stories about all these vaccine injured people and the fact that there was a cover up of it and they were being censored, I mean that's a salacious story that a lot of people would, or about the Epstein blacklist, right? Why don't they ever talk about that? I mean, people are interested in it. They would subscribe to read that. But there's a reason why they're not covering it. It doesn't have to do with their subscribers. I think it has to do with, the money, the people behind that.
I mean,
For the record, I've gone on record saying I'm not in that Epstein list, and Jay, I take Jay at his word that he is an
never met the man, never got
Okay.
any money from him. Bryce, I got to say, so
Yeah.
what your question like touches on very deep waters. Like there's a huge theological literature around this. Like there's a man named Rene Girard, who's a critical theorist at Stanford, who wrote about the scapegoating mechanism as a central psychological sort of reaction to crises caused by people wanting to copy each other's desires and not getting everything they want. The sort of like demonization is central, I think, to like human psychology. But the answer isn't to like lean into it. Joomi, I heard you about the media. They're leaning into it. The answer is to like recognize it for the great evil it is. You don't demonize other people. You don't scapegoat other people in the hope that your life will get better, because that never works out.
Jay, that's demonstrably false. Scientists compete for limited resources. They have incentives to destroy other scientists in
That's
unethical ways to get grants. I
that's
think,
one way to look at this. But on the other,
yeah,
another way to look at this is that if a scientist like Joomi or a scientist like Bryce Nickels comes up with an idea that's really, really interesting, I can adopt it and then build on it, and my work will be better as a result. Science is not a zero-sum game. Science is a positive-sum game. And in fact, I think almost all of human existence, looked at the right way, as a positive-sum game. The kind of demonization, you could have an equilibrium of demonization and destruction, and what that ends up being is it's not even just a zero-sum game; it's a negative-sum game. Like, you end up with a society that cannot like learn from each other, that cannot function in ways where we cooperate and make each other better off. And I think that that's the danger we're in. I mean, this is why I was so struck by your video, Jimmy. Because it struck me as that you were trying to get us away from that kind of culture. You're trying to shock people in out of this idea that I can be better if I can demonize the other.
Exactly.
Okay,
very
so
similar to Wilk Wilkinson, who we were talking with the other day. Like, somebody, and I completely agree, Jay. I completely agree with that. Like, the approach that you're using, Joomi, is I guess pro-social is the word. Like, trying to bring everyone together, and that's very rare. Like, it's much easier to keep people apart and just than it is to bring people together, because bringing people together requires that uncomfortable interaction that you had with your friend, where they'll say, like, oh, you must have some agenda. Like, it's not fun, but it can be it's like much more important and fulfilling. I also say that, I mean, so you're both saying that my idea of a purge is a bad idea. Is that what you're saying? Like, I just want to go for the record. You both oppose the purge. Is that true?
I think I would yeah, I think that's
Oh, see, I brought up the purge, and that's when the bell went up. We're getting sent. My purge idea gets censored on my own podcast. Anyway, okay, go ahead, Jay. Take us out.
well. I wanted to thank Joomi for joining us, and Bryce, thanks for this fun conversation. I think this is the way forward. We have to like tell people we're not human garbage. They're not people. Other people, just because they vote different, are not human garbage. In fact, the only way forward really is to like seek to understand where people are coming from. Even if you end up disagreeing, at least you are you're going to treat people like your neighbor, like you're supposed to treat them, like you love your neighbor as yourself. That golden rule really matters here. And it struck me, Jimmy, that the purpose of your video was to remind people of that. All right, enough my proselytization of people. Let's on this idea. Let's just let's end with this has been Professor Jay Bhattacharya talking with Bryce Nickels and Joomi Kim on Science from the Fringe. Until next time, thanks for listening.